Good afternoon. Hello to everybody. It's my big pleasure to present you our guest speaker, Paul Clyde, who is the president of the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. And Tom, I'm sorry for maybe a pronunciation, Lentos, professor of business administration at the Ross School of Business. I'm Sergey Gvozdev, professor at Kyiv School of Economics, and I work in several projects together with Paul. And I know that every time meeting with Paul was very, I would say, eye-opening, how to do things in a productive way. This time we met because we were discussing with Paul importance or lack of market competition in this region of the world. And Paul has extensive experience in working in countries of the Middle Europe. Paul, you was a consultant of Czech and Slovak government in early of the 90s, am I right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and you probably may say something to compare what was the development of our country comparing to countries of Central Europe. What was the leverage for their success and how we are looking in comparison with them? Could you please start sharing your experience?
Sure. And first, thanks very much for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm so sorry what we see every day going on in Ukraine, and impressed with the perseverance of organizations like yours in getting through and continuing to educate people. As to my experience, you're right. I worked in the Czech and Slovak republics in 1993, advising their governments on competition policy. And I remember at the time that many of the people there, so this was very shortly after they had started reforms. In fact, they didn't have a competition law at the time, and part of what we were doing there was assisting in the writing of one. That the people there were thinking that, okay, we're ready for GDP per capita to rise to Western levels because we've opened up our economies. Why isn't it happening yet? And we had a lot of discussions about that this was going to take generations for this to happen. And if we look a few generations later, we're 30 years on from that time period, we can see growth rates, per capita growth rates in the Visegrad countries, in Poland, the Czech and Slovak republics, and Hungary, that range from 80% to 200%. And so, Sergey, when you and I were talking about this, part of what I was interested in is, and for the audience, a little bit of background, we worked together, about 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, on management education programs in Ukraine. And part of what we were doing was reflecting on what would we do differently? What has happened since then that's different? And so I went back and I looked at GDP per capita growth rates in other countries in the area, including Ukraine. And I was surprised to see that Ukraine's had actually dropped between 1992 and 2020, I think was the last data that we had. And that was unique of countries in the area. But then you look into it in more detail and you can see why. Some of what was going on, so the Visegrad countries, they went through the past 30 years and basically, they had some internal political issues, they had elections and whatnot, but basically they were moving forward without significant outside intervention. The 2008 financial crisis hit hard, but that was somewhat that was the one event that they had that was similar to Ukraine, whereas Ukraine has experienced multiple interventions from Russia, 2004, 2014, and then also the 2008 financial crisis and the most recent invasion. And that does have impact on business, which we can talk about a little bit later. But the part that strikes me about this is that if you just look at GDP per capita, it's a little bit misleading, because I think, what I observed in my interactions with you and other colleagues in Lviv and elsewhere was significant development and sort of a change in attitude of what was going on. And the change that took place back in the early 90s, it's hard to overstate how significant it was. It was two systems of belief, which is why I use that title for this talk. And I should say, I'm borrowing that title from my mentor and Professor Harold Demsetz, who used it when talking about monopoly power, but talking about roughly the same thing, which are we better off with an economy in which you've got multiple actors out there competing in the marketplace and trying to develop new products, develop new services, and provide them to customers at a price they're willing to pay? Or are we better off with basically decisions being made by a small group of individuals? The clearest example of that is if you look at the former Soviet Union and the command and control that came out of that. But it's not limited to that. We see it all the time in markets all over the world, including in the United States, where you've got governments coming in and saying, and when you say government, ultimately there are a few individuals that are making this decision, either in an agency or a division somewhere, that are making a decision about what products should be produced, what price should be charged, and so on and so forth. And that change is hard to make. It's hard because to say, when you're used to direction coming about what products to produce, what services to provide, and what prices to charge, and all of a sudden you're saying, no, nobody provides that. It's determined by the market, by these actors that are competing with each other on the consumer side and the producer side, and they're going to determine what they're producing and what price they're charging. That's a difficult transition to make because it's almost like you're falling backward and hoping someone catches you. And I can tell you of a specific example in Slovakia when we were there. The price of bread suddenly went up dramatically. And we were, this happens, prices rise suddenly. And there are reasons that it rises. It rises normally because there's a demand shift or a supply shock. So either consumers all of a sudden are demanding a lot more, or on the supply side, there's something that happened that made it so that producers aren't able to produce as much. And you suddenly observe these spikes in prices. We were arguing unsuccessfully that the government shouldn't do anything about it. It should allow the price to be up there, because what was fundamentally going on was there wasn't enough supply to satisfy the demand that was out there. And if they allowed the price to be up there, it would send the right signal to producers that, everybody would start baking bread, that bread is in high demand. If you can figure out a way to produce bread, to procure the ingredients and produce it, you're going to make a lot of money doing it. And by producing bread, by increasing the supply of it, it would bring the price back down. That argument, though, is very difficult to sell when you've got a population that's not used to things like that happening and is expecting the government and holding them responsible for the price. And so the government did step in and they put in price controls and said that the price of bread cannot go any higher. The problem with that is it doesn't solve the fundamental underlying problem, that there wasn't enough bread to satisfy the demand that was out there. But that's the basic question. Are you going to allow competition to regulate the behavior in the market? So are you going to allow other bread producers to come along and start producing the bread to keep the price down? Or are you going to rely on a government to say, this is the price that it must be, you cannot charge a price above that? And I should add that, as I said, this isn't unique to the Slovak Republic at the time, or to Ukraine, or to the former Soviet Union. In this country, we have recently had a spike in gas prices, and our House of Representatives recently passed a bill precluding price gouging, whatever that may mean. But certainly it was saying that you can't charge too high a price. It was not relying on competition to be the regulator, when in fact there are outside factors that we can look at to see that the prices, we know why the price is going up. It's not because of it would be hard to argue that it was because of some collusive arrangement, because you'd have to say, why didn't the collusion happen before? But this tendency to look at shocks to the system and say we're going to rely on competition is a difficult thing to do. It's not easy for a government to resist the pressure that comes from a population when prices suddenly adjust like that. and there is a strong tendency for a government to want to try to do something about it. So that shift is significant. I think it's important to understand that A, how big of a change that was, and B, that no government has ever gotten away from it completely. It's constantly a challenge that governments are facing in one way or another. So then, if I go back to the question about Ukraine versus the Czech and Slovak Republic and Poland and Hungary, you see, you have to look at, well, why was it that those countries were able to make that transition? It did take a long time. I mean, those countries are doing very well now, but it didn't happen overnight. It happened over many years of allowing markets to work, and they still don't work perfectly in all these places, but increasingly they do. And we've seen industries arise in those markets that are very competitive globally. But if I look in Ukraine, we also see that. As you pointed out to me, the IT sector has been, and I know this from others, globally is very competitive. And so then you start looking at what happened. And I think this is an interesting question about what is it about the business structures and systems that have to develop? Because we can just say, well, leave the market free, but it's not quite that simple. So even if you are an advocate of free markets, which I am very much, there are bounds to that. We always talk about property rights, that the government does have a role in defining and defending property rights. So that if, there's a debate about who owns what asset, that there is a system that is in place to determine who legally has rights to that asset, that you can't just go and impose yourself on anyone else's property. And so how do those systems develop? And that's a very interesting question about how they develop and the benefits of them. And this is, a lot of this comes from my conversations with you. And so I sort of throw the question back to you, but there's a lot of talk about oligarchs in Ukraine. And my understanding of what we're talking about there is assets that have, during privatization, accrued to a small number of people, maybe not completely through market mechanisms, but most importantly, that the authority over those assets was retained not through competition and market mechanisms of providing goods and services that customers valued at prices they were willing to pay, but instead through favor with the government or making sure that you knew who the leadership was or the correct agency. And that process goes back to this fundamental distinction I was talking about before. It's not allowing competition to determine allocation of resources. It is relying on governments to determine what those allocation of resources and whoever it is that's in power. And that becomes a much more sort of arbitrary and random allocation mechanism. And it undermines the development of these boundaries, this system of property rights that is absolutely necessary to support a free market and the interactions within that market. And it makes it so that it's going to be more of a hurdle for other businesses to develop out of that. So I think that's a piece of it. But I think this disruption of the economy is another piece. I don't want to go on too long, so I'm happy to go into that, but I don't, if you want to take it another direction, please do.
Paul, I just remember the quote of William Davidson that what we do now, and more important, what we do not do now, will impact for all our lives. He was speaking about transition period. And what you said is maybe what your point of view from outside of Ukraine. It has such analytical approach, but listening it and being inside for the whole this period makes me feeling responsible for what we didn't do in a period of 90s when we just got this independence, so much willing, so much expecting by Ukrainians. And you was quite many times in different business schools in Ukraine. What was your observation? Why business education in Ukraine was so little bit impacting on the level of life of people? So it looks like we were studying from you, from America, from Western Europe. We were learning different methods of teaching. We were adopting different views of economy transformation. So it looks like everything was in place. But the result, the impact, in my point of view, was very limited. What was your opinion? What do we lack in that period of time?
So I mean, first of all, I have to say a lot of this I've learned from you and from other colleagues in Ukraine, because I haven't been there the whole time. I've been interacting with many of the people. And what I have observed and the colleagues I have been very impressive. I mean, they're crackerjack. They're very good business professors. They know what they're doing. They know what they're teaching. They know the concepts. And so, you know, from a technical perspective, there's nothing that I see that I think, oh, that was wrong. That couldn't have, that should have been done differently. And you know, this goes back to when we were having those the seminars. We would have these retreats done in Yalta and other places, that we had business faculty from all over the country over 20 years ago. And I got a chance to interact with many of them, and including, you know, with you when we went and did a separate executive education course with a specific company. I was very impressed with that company. I mean, they could have been operating anywhere. So what that tells me is this development was taking place. There were pockets of it. It wasn't pervasive necessarily, but this goes back, I think, to this notion of the interruptions in the economic development that took place. So, and you know, if with your permission, I'm going to borrow from some conversations you and I have had, where I've learned a lot from you about some of the things that have gone on. But one of the things that business needs is, I'm going to call it trust. And you've talked a lot about values that students demand and you've observed increasingly needing. And one of those values that I want to sort of emphasize is the importance of trust. In business transactions, it's too costly. I mean, I said property rights have to be established and defended by the government. That's absolutely right. But in the United States, if I end up in court, I've already lost because it's too expensive. So if I have that much of a disagreement with someone that I'm interacting with, that's a problem. That court system needs to be there, and that property rights system needs to be there as a threat, as a backdrop. But I have every incentive to work with whoever I'm engaging with in a way that doesn't require us to use it. I mean, I used to be at the Antitrust Division, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the vast majority of murders that we would investigate, if they got challenged, the parties just dropped them because they didn't want to go to court. It's too costly to end up in that system. But what that means is you have to have other ways of developing trust of each other. You have to, I mean, you think about long-term partnerships. Employment is in essence a long-term partnership. The suppliers you may interact with, customers you may interact with. You can't go and renegotiate your contract and every single time something happens. There has to be an overall understanding of trust between the two parties that is there. And there are two elements, and I'm not just talking about that as an emotional component. There are analytical parts to it too. And one of them that I think the business schools can and have played an important role in is, what are the mechanisms? What are the sort of the institutions you're using to analyze your business? So if I don't think you understand basic financial principles or basic marketing principles, I'm not going to be interested in hiring you as my agent to go and sell to some customer, because I don't think you're adopting the right approach. Whereas, and similarly, if you don't think that I have a good understanding of operations, of some of the basic concepts that are taught in an operations course, you might have some concerns about partnering with me because you don't think I'm going to be able to produce what you need me to provide. Now, the fact that we both use, if I talk about some basic business tools like cost benefit analysis in economics, variable versus fixed costs, the 4 Ps in marketing, STP analysis in marketing, some lean tools that I know you teach in operations. Those tools are a consistent framework that if I know that the partner I'm dealing with has been trained in those same tools and is using them, then I have some confidence that at least they've got the toolkit necessary to make this work. We may come to a different assessment about what the market looks like and what the size of the market is, and the different segments that are relevant, who we should be serving, or what the best way to do this operation is. But if we start with the same toolkit, that can play a big role in building up that trust. And I think the universities, I was struck by the fact when we were there 20 years ago, this was a grant, USAID grant, and there were 5, as I recall, very good business schools in Ukraine that were teaching, that were offering MBAs. And this was a USAID grant, and USAID had determined that there should be more schools there, part of it. There should be more universities teaching MBA programs, which made no sense to me because there were a total of like 60 graduates in all of Ukraine at the time. And 5 schools is plenty to be serving 60 graduates, and getting more would just make it difficult for those 5 to survive. But those 5 schools were, I knew the faculty there, I knew what they were teaching, and they were very good. And they were teaching this set of tools that were going to be valuable, not only to the company using them, but to partners that they might have, to suppliers that they might be working with, that they could have confidence that this company is using the same set of tools. So in that sense, there is a trust that is built up over time. And I think in that front, the business schools have played an important role in moving that forward. And I would also say, I think there's strong evidence that you were starting to see significant growth. In fact, you pointed out to me that if you look at the wealthiest individuals in Ukraine today, they're not all some of the past historical large companies, the oligarchs. Some of them are newer companies that have developed using market-based principles, subjecting themselves to the rigors of the market, and competing very effectively globally, especially in the IT area. That doesn't happen without people having the basic toolkits that are needed in order to make their business thrive. There's also a creativity. There's also willingness to think, an entrepreneurial spirit about it that has to be there. And that's developing as well. And so I said before that the GDP per capita had dropped, but that's an aggregate number. And it is misleading in that it's just talking about what happened on average. It's not talking about what is happening in individual cases. And I think if you look across Ukraine, you would find individual cases. We know that there are individual cases where companies were performing very well, and they were competing with everyone else in the global marketplace. The second element, because we've talked about it, if I could, I'm sorry to go on so long on this, but this trust element, if I go back to it, there's another component to it. And this is where I think the interruptions in the development of the economy come into play. One of the elements of any business relationship is, your willingness to work with me and my willingness to work with you is in part going to be a function of the fact that we're not just interacting in this period. We know that I want to make you happy, and I want you to trust me that I'm going to provide you with the goods that you can need and everything, because I'm hoping this goes on for many years. And so I have to believe that it's not just this year that I care about, but it's next year and the year after that and the year after that I care about. So this trust is partly a trust in the economic system that we will be allowed to continue to operate in that environment. And that's where I think you start getting this issue about the interruptions from the Russian government, largely, that keep intervening in the economy and undermining the ability of these companies to interact with each other on an ongoing basis. You and I might want to continue doing it, but if all of a sudden my supplies are stopped at a border because the Russian government has come in and taken over parts of Ukraine, that affects my ability to supply things. And so then that trust is undermined again, not because you don't trust me necessarily, but you don't trust the fact that this system is going to be able to persist over time. Yeah. And so, it was really interesting to me when you started talking about the values and the trust that was being built up, and that seemed to be growing over time, because I think that's an incredibly important part of the development of a free market and a competitive system that is going to thrive in the long run. But I think we can't underestimate the effect of that continued interruption. And it's not just that it happened those few years, that threat is always there. And so I always have to, as a business person, I always have to be taking that threat into account.
We spoke about the similarity of your considerations with very well known in theory of games concept of prisoners. So there are win-lose scenarios, but there is a win-win one when you trust to each other. So it sounds for me like you refer exactly to that case of trust between government and people, between people themselves. The history of us, of our country, in my opinion, teaches that very important balance should be between interest of government or maybe of the country with interest of individuality. And currently, we have the generation of people in most productive age who were developed, who grow up in such conditions so that they are enough professional, they really can compete in the world market. And at the same time, it was period of strengthening country solidarity, the same values. From my point of view, you can't teach trust in case studies. The trust is something, is a product of certain experience. And it's a hard time for us right now. But we believe that we will win. And we are in front. It was announced by many countries, Western countries, that they declared their willingness to participate in so-called Plan of Marshall, Plan of Recovery. And in this case, I think it will be a new challenge for us to make, to find the right balance between government participation, regulation of this plan, and market competition of different companies or different individualities to be participant of this plan of Marshall. What could you recommend? How to make this balance more efficient, or should it be only market tools to identify how to progress with implementation of the Marshall Plan?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question, and there are a couple of things I'd like to comment on. One is, I mean, as you correctly stated, the founder of our institute, Bill Davidson, was a firm believer in the power of the free market to develop, and the power of individuals to develop an economy, and that there would be, it wasn't just the economic well-being that would improve, but the social well-being too. It would give what he called a social freedom to the people, and that the economic development would be a key part of that. I want to comment a little bit on and I think you're seeing some of that in, the world. You may have known this, but I think when the world saw Russia invade, they did not think Ukraine would have the resolve and the resistance that we've observed over the past many days, months even now. And I think that's a measure of the fact that the people in Ukraine, they do have a trust in each other. They have a belief in each other. And there is sort of this entrepreneurial and this individualism that is very powerful. And that people believe that, as you said, I mean, and everyone I've spoken to there, is convinced that this is going to come to an end, that Ukraine will come out on top. And then the question is, where do we go and develop from there? And I think, going back to the last question, that very resistance that we've observed is evidence of the trust that has been being built up, and the development of the economy that doesn't just impact the economy, it impacts society at large, and the attitudes and the belief that there is a positive way forward in this. So I think that part is really important to emphasize. As to the question about the Marshall Plan, or a version of the Marshall Plan for Ukraine, it's a very good question. And I think I would go back to the same principles. And I can tell you, in my role at the William Davidson Institute, one of the things I'm constantly concerned about is, are we doing anything that undermines local companies' ability to survive and thrive? I mean, as you know, we work with the private sector, and we work with business educational institutions, and our goal is to develop that private sector. We never make investments ourselves, and I don't want to be picking winners. So when you go to this question about the role of the individual in competition versus the role of government, that is also a concern for outside governments. I mean, it could be not through any negative intention, but out of a sense of trying to help, that you put a bunch of money into some investments that, as long as the money is coming from the outside, those entities, those companies or those industries, whatever it is, are going to survive. They're going to keep going, not because they're subject to market forces and able to exist, but because they got outside money coming in. And once that outside money stops, they stop. And that will be very detrimental to an economy. And so I have principles in thinking about how, if somebody is going to be providing assistance, I would have principles. And one of the first ones would be, do no harm. Don't make investments, whether on purpose or inadvertently, that are going to be undermining the ability of the local of the Ukrainian population, the Ukrainian businesses, to develop and determine their own way that they're going to develop. So that's something that, and this isn't an abstract thought. We've seen this happen over and over again. And I can give you examples in other industries too. Like in this country, there's a strong incentive to, and around the world, to develop alternative forms of energy. And in doing so, sometimes governments make investments in wind or in solar or in whatever it is. That isn't a market force. That's the government picking them. And then those solar companies or those wind companies will do well, but only because they're getting this outside funding. If you really want to see what's going to happen, if the one way to deal with that would be to tax the externality, tax the fossil fuel, tax the part that you don't like, and allow the market to come up with what the solution is that it wants to develop. So you create the environment for it, but allow the competitive forces to determine what the outcome is. In the context of Ukraine, what is it that can be done to facilitate the development of these businesses? Now, we've talked about the incredible damage that's being done, physical damage to infrastructure around the country. That is something that, arguably it's appropriate for a government to be providing and to be investing in. And the existence of an infrastructure will be valuable and important in the development of the business community. Now, that doesn't mean the government has to be the one that actually builds it and runs it, but they will probably play a role in funding it, and outside forces in funding it. So you could imagine things like IFC type relationships, where there are loans that are made available that are favorable, and maybe there is some money that is given to develop infrastructure type projects. But I think you would want to be very careful how you're going about doing it, and constantly the objective has to be to develop the private sector, because it is the Ukrainian private sector that is going to bring that economy out and make it help the transition, not only economically, but socially. Mm-hmm. I mean, just an aside on that, the development over the past 20, 30 years has been truly astonishing worldwide. And it's primarily due to the market economy. We hear a lot of bad news all the time, but let me just give you one statistic. According to the World Bank, the poorest, the category of the poorest population, the poverty, has dropped from around 30% to less than 10%. That's an astonishingly, so we're not just talking about the well-to-do. There's a lot of talk about the rich are getting richer and the poor staying poor. No, this is the poorest part of the population globally has shrunk from about 30% to less than 10%. That's an astonishing outcome. And a lot of that is due to the private sector. So the private sector will thrive and will develop if it's allowed to do so. And then, you know, to your point about what's the role of government, what's the role about individuals, the government does have a role to set up the property rights, to set up the boundaries within which that is going to play. And you just have to be very careful not to set those boundaries so narrowly that you're effectively dictating everything that's going to happen in that economy. But it is important to have a court system that's reliable, a set of laws that are reliable, so that you can develop that trust that we were talking about before. But then step back and the market will come up with solutions that no single individual could ever anticipate. I mean, this was one of Hayek's points, you know, back in the mid 1900s, that the market is all of the information coming from all these disparate individuals coming together. Some of them are going to be stupid ideas. Some of them are going to be brilliant ideas, but the market will determine which ones win, because consumers will gravitate toward that. And that is always going to be superior to what any small group of individuals, no matter how smart they are, could come up with on their own. Mm-hmm. So you absolutely want to create systems that allow you to tap into the wealth of information that is out there in the population. And, you know, in the case of Ukraine, we are seeing that. We are seeing that today. We're not, and you know, it's not like it's died during the current war that's going on. Your school, other schools continue to educate students, to continue to develop the people, and the businesses are continuing to work and strive in an incredibly difficult environment. So, you know, think what could be done if that wasn't going on, the kind of development that you could see.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Your last comments reminded me another quote of very famous in Ukraine professor, worldwide famous professor Gavrilishin. He said that about European Union, there is a misunderstanding how much is it effective in every region, in every country of it. And he said that in his opinion, the role of government should be focused on providing such necessary things as equal access to knowledge, equal rights in front of the court, equal access to medical treatment, and equal responsibility for the ecology, for the place where they are living, so that things which they are doing right now will not destroy land, countries for their kids and new generations. Mm-hmm. I think that's I can talk with you, you know, in hours about all those things, finding the right balance. But I think we can give the word to our participants of our webinar. I see that we have one of participants' question. How do you think can market competition and deregulation help to lower corruption? What do you think about this issue?
So one of the concerns about having the government play such a big role in the allocation of resources in the economy. I mean, part of it is this information issue that I just spoke about, that no single individual can have as much as information as the group does. And that doesn't just impact the price where the market comes up with the market clearing price. It also impacts the creativity, the new products, the new services that are developed, how they're produced, all sorts of things that go on in the economy. But one of the major concerns about it is it creates the opportunity for corruption, because now there are a few agents that you know that you can go to try to get favor. And so even if I'm the most honest person in the world, people are going to be coming to me all the time offering me payment to get some sort of favorite treatment. If the market is what's in control, there's nobody, no single individual you go to try to get favorable treatment. The best thing you could do is improve your product, improve your service, lower your cost structure, or come up with a new product. And all of those are good things. Those are all valuable. Corruption is just one way to think about it is it's a shift in existing resources. It doesn't create new ones. In fact, it undermines the incentive to develop new ones, but it's just shifting it from one party to the other. And so the more you've got the government in control, the more you're opening yourself up to that. If you look at countries around the world, it's almost always true that the capital country is the capital city is the largest city. And that's not true in the United States, but the United States is an interesting example on this. If you go back to the early 1900s, Washington, D.C. was insignificant because the economy was largely operating on its own. The government didn't have much of a role in it. And then all of a sudden you had this significant increase in the role of government in industry, particularly in the 30s and a lot of the New Deal's regulation, but even in the teens, there were some agencies that were created. If you look at FTC, the SEC, a lot of the commissions that were created were in the early part of the 20th century. And today, the Washington area is huge. It's a major city within the United States. And part of that is because companies now recognize that that's part of how they have to compete. They have to have representation in the city, in the capital city. So that it encourages, whether it's corruption or whether it's, I'm not commenting on whether it's legal or not. Some of it is certainly legal. There's lobbying that goes on all the time and whatnot. But the incentive structure has completely, it shifts to making it so that you want to influence those people who are having such an impact on the allocation of resources that take place out there.
Sorry. Maybe some other questions.
If there, can I make one more comment? I'm happy to answer other questions, but just to go back to this issue of the cooperation between individuals when we were talking about suppliers and consumers, there's a little bit of a, I don't want to leave the impression that in a free market economy, everyone is working together in some sort of, family fashion. They're not. I mean, and this goes back to my point about competition being the regulator. If I'm competing with you, I'm not friendly with you necessarily. I'm trying to steal your customers. I'm trying to actively get customers that are yours right now. And that is perfectly, as long as within the bounds of the law, within the bounds of property rights, that is not only perfectly acceptable, it's absolutely necessary. The thing that keeps that, if I go back to my bread story, the thing that makes me not concerned that the price is too high is that there are other bread, anyone else can enter that market and produce bread. And if they aren't, it must be because their cost structure is too high and they can't make money doing it. But if the price of bread is up there and they can make money doing it, they're going to enter that market, and they have the incentive to. They're going to steal customers from the existing producers. They're not going to be friendly with them, but they're still trusting. You're still trusting in the system, and the system is working. And it's just that you're relying on competition as the regulator of that price, not the government. You're relying on the existence of outside forces. And so the government plays the exact opposite role in that case. The first thing I look at is the government prohibiting entry into that market in some way? And if they are, I would want to get rid of that. But as long as there's nothing stopping others from entering a market, I'm not going to be concerned about what a company is doing. They can go ahead and try to raise price for a while, but they're not going to be able to do that forever because competition is going to come in and is going to discipline them.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. I have an interesting observation that majority of our fast-growing companies in IT business are representatives of so-called netocrats generation, and so suddenly I discovered that real market competition goes in the area of IT, which was under less control, under less understanding of current oligarch businesses. So in every case, when we speak about more traditional businesses, somehow the question was how to protect themselves from being acquired, or how to say this in a polite way, so that they will be not robbed by some criminal organizations. So IT was the area which was most of all oriented on solving problems of customers. And it was out of real understanding by big companies which are existing on the rules of former Soviet Union of administrative power. Interesting would be to observe how this success of IT companies, Ukrainian IT companies in the world arena, how it will impact on other industries, how it will be disseminated by more traditional businesses. It looks like we have one more question from public. Just a moment. What do you think about Ukrainian government's activities for businesses right now?
So I'm not that familiar with what they're doing specifically with respect to businesses right now. But in general, is there something in particular that is being considered?
Just a moment. What do you think about? Could you please, Oksana, if you could please clarify your question? We don't have Oksana. Could you please specify your question?
So I can give you a generic answer. But I mean, one of the important roles of government is to create some sort of stability so that the market can operate. And that goes back to that trust I was talking about. If I trust in the system that it's going to continue operating the way that it has in the past, it's easier for me to do business and to be more productive. So government's role is definitely to establish property rights and defend them and create a stable environment for the market economy, understanding that the market is going to go through its ups and downs, and individual businesses will as well. And that's not a bad thing. That's just the way the market works.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I don't see at this current moment any. Oh, just a moment, maybe it will come. No, I don't see any other questions. Paul, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And it was a great pleasure, a new chance to work with you even on such a brief event. And I look forward meeting with you, working, and we spoke about trust. And I must say that my personal experience working with Paul, that is the best possible example of trust. I learned from Paul how to work with business, how to provide professional services, but I also learned a lot from Paul of his personal values. And I'm very glad that you have a chance to see Paul and to listen to him. And if some of you have intention to continue to raise questions which we didn't respond right now, I am more than happy to be contact between you and Paul. Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you, Serhii. It was an honor to be here and a real pleasure to talk to you. And I have thoroughly enjoyed our interactions with you and other colleagues in Ukraine, and I look forward to to more. And as I said, I see a lot of promise and hope in what has been going on in Ukraine. And once this war comes to a close, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I expect the economy to develop significantly.
Thank you, and wish everybody a good evening without alarms and without shooting. Take care.